behalf of the government of the Republic of North Macedonia and our partners who are joining us here today. My name is Frosina Antonovska. I'm an advisor to the Minister in the Ministry of Environment and Physical Planning of the Republic of North Macedonia, and I will be the moderator of this session. Thank you for joining us here physically and also virtually for those who are following us on the COP26 platform and the YouTube channel. This event is called Solving the Climate Crisis Together, and we got that idea when the European Centre for Non-for-Profit Law approached us as a Ministry of Environment proposing to address the issue of working together to deliver. The ESNL supports the creation of enabling laws for freedom of association, assembly and participation, including for climate activists. Before we start with the discussion with our guest speakers who we have here, I will invite Esther Hartey to briefly present the background of the event and set the framework for the following discussion.
Thank you, Frosina. We need trust and confidence for climate mitigation and just transition. Trust can be achieved through open processes and meaningful participation, involvement of those who care and are affected by the climate change. Individuals and civil society can bring awareness about the challenges we face by the climate crisis. There is an amazing energy in people, youth, and communities who push for more ambitious climate commitments. They want to participate, not just in problem detection, but also in problem solution. But participation is being challenged. Globally, laws and regulations are enacted to limit access to information or funding for environmental groups. Companies are taking activities to courts for protesting against fossil fuel and extractive industry projects that harm the environment. So we need to move from restriction to protection. We need to build confidence in participation. There are models and ways for governments to involve civil society rather than silence its voice. The Ministry of North Macedonia successfully led such collaboration. That example and others we will hear today can help to elevate the benefits of participation. Many groups here in the Green Zone, at home in the areas threatened by the rising waters and wildfires, want to be in the room where decisions are made, to sit together with governments, brainstorm, and draft together creative answers for the problem we face. And this is why the European Centre for Not-for-Profit Law wanted to organize this session and hope that it will inspire such collaborations. Mark Twain said, "The future interests me. I'm going to spend the rest of my life there. But the future depends on today, so let's solve the climate crisis together." Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Now we can go on with the panelists that we have here today. So I will present them all at once so that we have more time for discussion afterwards. We have Minister Nasser Noureddini, Minister of Environment and Physical Planning of the Republic of North Macedonia. We have Mr. Clement Vaux. He's the UN Special Rapporteur of the Rights for Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and of Association, who we're going to be having online. We have Mr. Anthony Babington, International Program Director of Natural Resources and Climate Change at the Ford Foundation. We have Natalia Pena. She's a climate change policy advisor at Earth Rights. She's also joining us online today. And we have our partners who also participated in the organization of this event, and that's Mr. Greg Walker, International Environmental Communication Association, and Lynn Wilson from the SeaTrust Institute. I would kindly ask my panelists to try to limit their intervention to 2 to 3 minutes so that we actually would be able to take questions from the audience here and virtually, if that's possible, through the platform, and to give a possibility for meaningful participation in this conversation. Now we'll start with a couple of different thematic segments of the topic, and the first one is on the importance and benefits of participatory processes. For that, I would ask the first question to the Minister. The government of North Macedonia submitted its enhanced NDC, and what we can see from the document is that it was established through a broad participatory process. So would you like to tell us why was this multi-stakeholder approach important, and what specific benefits did you see from such participation?
Sure. Thank you very much, Frosina. Dear partners, dear panelists, dear participants, thank you for taking your time to participate in our side event. First of all, I'd like to quickly touch base on our enhanced NDC, because I think it's important to also know what we've actually achieved through this inclusive participation. We have managed to propose, or actually enhanced NDC is a reduction of 51% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 1990, apologies, and this is feasible because we have actually done this in a very thorough way, and this is only possible because we actually included all stakeholders. We didn't just include us politicians who have dreams of presenting such a wonderful NDC, but at the same time we actually included the youth whose voice needs to be heard through different kind of meetings, also virtual, and most importantly the private sector, because they're the ones that actually will need to be changing their ways and their behavior. What is, sorry, I'm just going to put this a bit further down, what was very important and remains very important is the inclusion of the CSOs and the NGOs. They're the ones actually usually that have the brightest ideas, and those are the ones that we need to have the discussions with. Those are the ones that actually we need to sit down and we see them as partners, not only in the creation of these policies, but the most important part is the implementation tomorrow, because they are pretty much our partners who are going to help us apply these and implement these policies. They're the ones that link us to the citizens. They're the ones that can be the bridges between the policies that they propose together with us, of course. I'm not saying they're going to be the ones carrying the message. These are actually some of their messages themselves. They're the ones that are going to be helping us apply them tomorrow. And hence why I always like to say to the CSOs, please do work together with us, because I see them as partners, because usually the Minister of Environment and Climate Change is the opposition in position in reality when you look at it in government. I don't mean that our government is not pro changing the green agenda and climate change, but of course industry is one thing, and I always need support from the ministry, sorry, if I may put it that way. The ministry always needs support from the CSOs and from the citizens in order to be able to have a louder and bigger voice in government. Hence, this is our proposal, hence why at the same time with the collaboration of the CSOs and the citizens, and especially the youth, who I always say be loud, because then it will be clearer for us. We've also aligned ourselves as a country, as a government, fully to the European Green Deal. We're not an EU member, we are a candidate country. However, though, we're fully aligned ourselves to the Green Deal, and we look forward to having a sustainable future in our country. Thank you. I hope I didn't take too much of your time.
That was perfect, thank you. I would like now to refer and include our first online speaker. That's Mr. Clement Wu. Mr. Clement, you recently published a specific report on climate justice. What did you observe in terms of challenges for civil society and people's participation and engagement? I'm not sure we can hear you. Can you please try to unmute yourself?
Okay. Thank you very much, Frosina. It is a privilege to join you today remotely, and I commend the Republic of North Macedonia for organizing this important event along with civil society organizations. As you know well, the failure by the government and businesses to address the unfolding climate crisis spurred the global protest movement in the last 5 years, with people taking to the streets to demand forceful and ambitious climate action and the protection of the health of biodiversity. We saw protests in many cities, small towns, and outside the venue of global climate negotiation and meeting, just like we are seeing now around COP26. Yet, as more people around the world organize to pressure government to take effective action and protect humanity from the devastating effects of climate change, violent repression against protesters and civil society has also increased. In the report that I presented to the United Nations General Assembly, I raised my concern about many challenges and threats facing those in civil society exercising their right to peaceful assembly and association to advance climate justice. I will briefly mention three of my key concerns. The first one, we document a rise in physical attacks and intimidation. The most pressing challenge climate activists face is a physical attack, including killing. Sadly, over 70% of human rights defenders killed every year are standing up for the environment. Physical attacks are often preceded by online and offline harassment and intimidation, including smear campaign, creating a context in which the physical attack becomes justified or normalized or even enabled. We have also seen climate activists labeled as extremists and green criminal, cast as anti-development and foreign-funded and terrorist groups. Secondly, we have also observed a global crackdown of climate protests. Climate activists have faced a proliferation of law and government action limiting and banning their assemblies. A growing number of laws limiting and banning assemblies specifically targeted climate protests or criminalized formally legal methods that climate protests use, example, road blocking. Some states have passed law criminalizing protests concerning or involving critical infrastructure. We have also observed use of force to enforce these restrictions. And the third one that also I highlight in my reports is that we continue to receive reports of limited space for participation in climate-related decision-making. Climate defenders regularly face barriers to obtain access to UN-level climate change negotiation, often imposed by the organizers themselves. Just take a look at this COP. Civil society groups are saying that this might become the most exclusive COP ever. Myself, I witnessed, even joining these side events, I have to go through a lot of process. I was sitting here for almost 2 hours to just navigate through this complex platform. How can we ensure that those working, those coming from grassroots level, environment, or those working far can join this important discussion? We have also witnessed exorbitant travel costs and complex COVID-19 rule were as a barrier for civil society actors, especially in the global south, to attend the conference. And for those that are already here, reports indicate that they have been excluded from all negotiation and decision-making space, limiting their ability to meaningfully engage. On Wednesday, civil society observers had only access to the pavilion, restaurants, and side event, and cannot access critical negotiation. And NGOs are experiencing logistic hurdle and long delay in accessing the venue itself due to the enhanced security measure. I reiterate my call to the UK government and the conference secretariat to address the concern raised by civil society and ensure the COP remain inclusive. There are many other challenges documented in the report, and I encourage you to read that. And it is important, as I mentioned in my statement, that the important gathering, decisive gathering, enjoy also the support of community, citizens, and all of those who are concerned about the climate change. I thank you.
Yes, can you just please also give us one or two good, inspiring examples of how civil society engagement can be really successful in climate issues?
Well, I think we know that the window of opportunity to address climate crisis is rapidly closing. And the moment to ensure participation is now during the COVID-19, to ensure that governments step up their pledge to meet the challenges we face. I think it is ultimately important that civil society and indigenous people voices are heard at this critical conference. Indigenous people and civil society, including women-led organizations, Youth striker and trade union need to be included as part of the solution. The ability of individuals to mobilize, organize, and connect to contribute to shaping public opinion and decision-making without fear is essential to the production of effective climate action. I'm inspired and encouraged by civil society and community that is gathering at COP26. I'm still receiving a lot of concern raised by those people, but they are continuing to do everything they can to assess. And I think this kind of side events, organized and supported by North Macedonia, is also one of the best practices that we should encourage. How government can involve civil society in the discussion and ensure that meaningful discussion, meaningful involvement is not only civil society sitting around the table, but also their voice to be heard and their concern to be taken in account. And I think this is the only way that we can together work towards fighting against this global warming, making sure that the planet and the future of this generation is safe.
Thank you. I'm going to go back here in the room now. Mr. Bebbington, please tell us a little bit about the work of the Ford Foundation under the Natural Resources and Climate Change Program and the pledge that you just took part of at this COP now to support indigenous people and communities. Can you please tell us a little bit more about it and the reason to be part of it?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. The Ford Foundation is at its core a social justice foundation. And that means that the Natural Resources and Climate Change Program is also at its core a social justice program. And the way in which we connect natural resources and climate change through a social justice lens is largely through focusing on strengthening or supporting the strengthening, we don't do the strengthening, of two sets of rights, broadly speaking, of indigenous peoples and local communities. One set of rights are those rights related to the control of, access to, use of, governance of land and territorial resources. And the second set of rights relate to, which are not necessarily formal rights, but rights in principle, relate to the right to benefit from the revenues that flow from resources that are on the lands and territories that indigenous peoples and local communities occupy and or claim as their historic territories. And we do that work in two particular geographical, if you will, contexts. One of those is forests and forest margin areas, and the other relates to extractive industry, so subsoil resources, minerals, hydrocarbons, and so forth. Often those two contexts can overlap. That focus on indigenous peoples and local communities has many, many rationales, but one of them is the fact that they are among those groups most affected by the forces driving, not just the impacts of climate change, but the drivers of climate change. Many of those drivers occur on the lands and territories occupied by those peoples as investors and government authorities also seek to access those natural resources for a variety of purposes. And in the process, also engage in some of the sorts of criminalization and silencing and intimidation that the Special Rapporteur was just talking about. So that's briefly on Ford. Moving slowly to the pledge, the second observation would be that those communities sit at the epicenter of climate change mitigation, or epicenters. And I want to mention two senses in which that's the case. One is the forest question. So it's quite clear here at COP, the recognition that forests are essential part of any strategy of moving to 1.5 degrees. And it's also quite clear from the science that those forests are much more likely to remain standing when the land and territorial rights and also the rights to free, prior and informed consent and governance authority of local communities are respected, and those communities are able to exercise their role as forest guardians. So they stand at the epicenter of the climate question, mitigation question, through their relationship to forests, but also in many respects through their relationship to subsoil resources. Not just in those instances where their territories may lie on top of hydrocarbon deposits, but increasingly we're thinking much more about the resources that will be required for the energy transition. One of the things that cannot be overstated enough, I think, is that the energy transition will be a mineral-intensive transition. And those minerals lie on the lands and under the lands, in many cases, of indigenous peoples and local communities. And if their right to those resources, or to those lands, and to consultation and free, prior, and informed consent are not recognized, then the process of extracting those resources, A, will not be socially just in any sense, and so we couldn't possibly talk about just transition. But it's also likely to be conflictive in ways that could slow down those investments in those resources that are necessary for the transition. I mean, the scale that we're talking about is enormous. Colleagues at the University of Queensland estimate that the copper required for the transition, this is a rough estimation, would lead to 9 times more tailings for copper mines in the first half of this century than were produced in the whole of the last century. So the footprint we're talking about is enormous, and it is on somebody's lands. Which is what takes us to the pledge. I have a colleague here in the room, Kevin Curry, who could say much more about the pledge in discussion session and question and answer. But the pledge is founded on those principles, they're principles, but they're also grounded in science, that the stronger the territorial and property and governance rights of indigenous peoples and local communities in forest environments, the pledge is specifically for tropical forest environments, the more likely those forests are to remain standing. And so this is a pledge of a mix of public donors and private philanthropic donors to commit resources over 5 years, beginning from January of this year, to support, in particular, actions around strengthening and protecting the property, land, and territorial and resource rights of those communities, and supporting their capacities to be able to exercise those rights and their role as forest guardians more effectively. So that's the rationale for the pledge.
Thank you. I think now it would be a good time to include Natalia Gomez-Pena, who is the Climate Change Policy Advisor, as I said, from Earthrights and joining us online. Hello, Natalia. Can you please share more about your campaign on front lines of climate justice? What inspired you to start it, and what is your main goal?
Thank you for the invitation. So I think having this conversation today about the importance of citizen participation in climate action is really key. And as the Special Rapporteur was telling, is especially key because we're seeing this COP as a COP that is looking like it's very, very exclusionary. We knew that before coming to this COP, we knew that many of our colleagues from the Global South were not able to attend because of the high costs and the quarantine requirements. But it's really shocking to see that once delegates, civil society observers, and individuals and indigenous organizations are there, they're also facing all these difficulties to access the negotiations, as the Special Rapporteur described. So I just wanted to echo his call to the Paris, to the UK Presidency, and to the UNFCCC Secretariat to ensure that citizen participation can be a reality for this COP. So, Front Lines of Climate Justice is the new campaign that ERAS International has built. This campaign builds on the work of local communities and defenders around the world that in the face of the climate crisis are working to demand profound change. The campaign is looking to amplify their voices, but also expose those tactics that they are suffering that are violating their communities' rights. And also building on the rapporteur's report, through our campaign and through the work that we do with communities and indigenous communities around the world, we have found 3 specific trends that are really affecting participation in climate action that I wanted to share today with you. So the first basic trend that we have found is, at the most basic level, is just a blocking of public participation. This happens, as the rapporteur was describing, at the international level, where civil society is not able to participate at COP negotiations, but also happens at the national level. For example, in Thailand, in the Omkhoi village, a community, a Karen indigenous community, just learned about a proposed coal mine that was going to install in their territories when the company arrived and told them basically that they have to leave because their lands have been concessioned. So there was no public participation there. A second trend that we have seen is that when companies sometimes meet resistance from communities, they coordinate, and we are worryingly see that they are coordinating with public security forces to use brute force against those communities that are resistant. This is, for example, what we have seen in northern Minnesota communities, indigenous communities, that were resisting the arrival of Line 3, a new pipeline extension, and that started all this process to oppose to this pipeline that was going to affect their territories, their sacred territories, and their rights that they have under treaties. And then their opposition and their protests were met with a lot of police violence. Then the last trend that we have found is that in cases where companies don't use brute force, they are using some more subtler tactics to silence communities. This is including lobbying for statutes that criminalize peaceful protests, or targeting activists with, as we know now, as SLAPP suits and other forms of judicial harassment, or mainly engaging in disinformation campaigns, and was something that the rapporteur was also very vocal in his presentation. And this, for example, is what is happening to our partners from FENAMAT, which is an indigenous organization from the Peruvian Amazon. FENAMAT is an organization that is working to protect the territories of the Mashco-Piro peoples, which is an indigenous group in isolation. FENAMAT publicly denounced how the Peruvian state concessionated some logging permits in the territory of the Mashco-Piro peoples in the middle of the pandemic, with the risk that the loggers were going to bring COVID-19 to the Mashco-Piro peoples in isolation. And then, because of their public denounces, they received a lawsuit from the company. And in the first instance, the judge ruled against FENAMAT and basically told the organization that they needed to stop their activities. This is a really worrisome precedent that Rights International is supporting to bring to court, but this is just an example of the type of restrictions that local communities and frontline communities are facing around the world. So just to finish, the goal of our campaign is really to ensure that policymakers recognize the central role that frontline communities must play in the global response to the climate crisis, but also we are working to defend the rights of frontline communities to speak up without fear of reprisals. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. So you already touched base on this a bit, talking about the challenges to participation and engagement, but I would like to invite Mr. Bevington again to talk a little bit more about this trend that is happening in the natural resources space when companies are using this so-called SLAPPs. So what are SLAPPs and what is their impact in environmental activism and the whole environmental fora?
SLAPPs are suits. SLAPP stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. And they are essentially civil suits to sue activists, lawyers, working with the sorts of organizations that Natalia was just talking about and so forth, with a view to distracting them, silencing them, and draining them of resources. There's no real rationale for the suits except that. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center, who are a grantee of ours, I should say, to be transparent, released a report not long ago, and their estimate is that since 2015, there are some 355 cases that bear the hallmarks of SLAPP suits in their mind, which is a considerable number of cases. Those cases are primarily in the Global South, 39% of them in Latin America, 25% in the Asia Pacific, and a good number of them also involve criminal charges as well as civil charges. And they also, the report by the resource center is also helpful because it maps those suits across sectors, if you will. And they are primarily in the natural resources sector: mining, agriculture, logging, palm oil, but especially mining. One of our grantees in South Africa, the Center for Environmental Rights, was together, one of its former staff members, together with other activists, were subject to a SLAP suit brought by an Australian mining company that went on for years. And the company was looking for indemnization of just shy of $1 million or so, which is an enormous amount of money for the sorts of activists and organizations that they were pursuing. And I want to read out, in this instance, the court found against the company for the time being and recognized the use of identifying something as a SLAP suit as a legitimate form of defense. And the judge who exercised the ruling said, corporations should not be allowed to weaponize our legal system against the ordinary citizen and activists in order to intimidate and silence them. It appears that this mining company's defamation suit is not genuine and bona fide, but merely a pretext with only the purpose to silence its opponents and critics. And on that grounds, supported the defendants in that case. This doesn't mean the case is open. The company has expressed, at least as of writing of these articles, its intent to appeal the decision. But that's what SLAP suits do. They're a variant of other tactics. Government agencies using the tactics of extended tax audits, of extended investigation of non-governmental organizations' human rights policies, human resources policies, as forms of distraction and of draining of resources, and the two primary resources for those organizations, which are time and money. So we do see it in our sector, and our grantees have had to respond in some instances to SLAP suits.
Thank you. So we covered the external challenges to participation, but Lynn, from your work and experience, can you tell us what are the complexities and tensions in multi-stakeholder collaborations? How can we elevate the benefits of partnerships and create broader, flexible, and more functional collaborations?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss collaboration in maybe a different way. In our work, which we are an international research and educational NGO, and we've been around about 17 years, doing work in the field all over the world doing this, and we've discovered that perhaps collaboration ought to be turned on its head. That we go in with a mindset of going into a place and saying, these are the things we need to do to engage a stakeholder, and so let's put them at the table, let's do it in this order. And perhaps if we rethought that and said, let's put together a different sort of process led by different people, and that we go in the governance roles of creating an enabling situation wherein the people can actually ask the questions that are meaningful to them, and we support that in building the collaboration, instead of imposing what the collaboration looks like. Historically, we go into a collaboration to, there's a paradigm that we've put together that looks at this so that one can meaningfully put together a purposeful approach to collaboration. That instead of where we go in and usually interchange our information with one another, and the people who've convene the process take that away and create something and say, now here's what you're going to do, and this is what we call effectiveness, then instead there are two other levels. One of them is where you will exchange both your methods as well as your knowledge and begin to sort of change one another in how you look at it. But that doesn't get us there either, because what are we called on to do here? We're called on to innovate. And that's a third thing altogether. And in order to do that, that's where I think we might wish to turn the collaboration process on its head. And when you go out into the field to convene a collaboration, you can engage youth as the people to go ask those questions, but with the support of leaders in a community who will help mentor those youth and make this a policy-appropriate approach to what it is they need to know and questions. But it isn't for us, it is for the next generations that we're doing this all together. And so engaging them in a way that asks their questions, where we can innovate something brand new that we've never thought of, because we're pretty entrenched in the way we look at this. And I think giving them the opportunity to reframe the question, supporting that question, and creating that enabling environment makes a huge difference. And that means that when we go into those situations to scope out a collaboration, we ask a different kind of question, something like, what has changed? What have you seen that's changed? And begin the conversation with people where they are and build up from that. This isn't just top down or bottom up or vertical. It's all of those things at the same time iteratively. You have to have the top down, you have to have the policy, you have to have the support of government or multiple governments. But in order to do that and not get stalled out, we need to keep the conversation going related to change, and it's happening so fast. So that's where I would start.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, before we get to the next set of questions, I would like to invite the audience if there is any question that, for those who are participating here physically, or maybe a question from the virtual participants. My colleagues are here, there are no questions at the moment? Virtually, we don't have a question yet. Someone from here? No? Okay, then we'll have another Q&A session at the end so everyone can take part. So let's go to how to engage, what Lynn started talking about. Minister Noureddini, the Republic of North Macedonia also adopted its long-term strategy on climate action with an action plan. How do you plan to ensure the regular and meaningful inclusion of civil society in the implementation of these policies? What will be the mechanisms to engage civil society organizations in the implementation, in the monitoring, and the evaluation of the action plan to make sure that these targets are actually met?
Thank you, Christina. Well, based on the fact that the measures and policies that we have proposed, and there's approximately, I think, if I'm not wrong, 63 of them in order to achieve our targets, they've been worked together with the civil society, so in order to actually be able to implement them, they will have to be a part of this, and as if we want to be successful, we have to include them. Furthermore, though, as a policy on a legal side, we're trying to see how we can actually make it let's not use the word must, but actually have it on a legal basis as well. So on the law on climate action, we'd like to include the energy governance regulation directive from the EU, so to speak, try and actually include that their participation is going to be imperative in that. As I said earlier, we should not forget that, and based on the comments, so maybe I'm going to change the question around a little bit, because you're saying the top down, yes, governments are here to create the policies. The policies need to be inclusive with everyone else. Of course, the academia has to be part of it, because a lot of the desires and wishes we have as citizens or as youths, we need to be basing that with science as well, and whether it's going to be possible in the future. But at the same time, though, as you said earlier, excuse me, as you said earlier, there needs to be a bottom-up approach as well. The bottom-up approach will be from the civil society. They're the ones going to be doing the campaign awareness programs. They're the ones that actually be informing the citizens and actually working together with the citizens, working together with the public sector, working together with the private sector. Unfortunately, what I hear here from, of course, some different panelists sounds worrying and slightly disturbing, to be quite honest with you, that civil societies get, unfortunately, pushed around. If I can use our country as an example, the 2016 elections, although we are a democratic country and we continue to be a very democratic and sovereign country, in 2016 they will call it I think it was called a colourful revolution that we had in the elections. So based on 2016, there was these CSOs, there was these citizens, there was the youth that got out on the streets, and they're the ones that made noise. They wanted a change of policies, they wanted a change of direction. They're the ones that created this government that we are right now. A government which has, as I mentioned earlier, has actually been looking at all these things that the youth, the CSOs, and everyone else is speaking about. Air pollution has always been an issue, unfortunately, in our country. Our citizens and the CSOs made it very clear that the new government needs to tackle that. Well, we have been trying to tackle that. We know it hasn't been solved yet. We're still working on it. it costs, I mean, it costs a lot of money, of course, and time. It's not just the money we're looking at. So the inclusion of the CSOs and the citizens has been constant in our country, and it has to be constant over this last few years, of course. And I'm sure it's going to remain if we actually put it on a legal basis as well, in the law. And I believe that any other future government will respect it. However, though, just to come back into some other comments that were made, and because we're speaking about a country, ours, North Macedonia, is in Europe. We're not an EU candidate country. We're not a developing country as you would actually see per definition. We're a country in transition. We're between developing and developed. However, though, as I heard from other areas in the world, there seems to be different issues. Maybe we'll need to question ourselves, because at the end of the day, each of us individually, we're consumers. And it's the large companies, the large multinationals that are actually maybe using or not using the land and the forests of these people, and they may be misusing their rights. As I said earlier, we, the consumers, we are the ones that make the decision at the end. So you have to question yourselves whether you want to be buying those products or not, or using those services being provided by certain companies, if they are proven to be misusing people's lands and rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, coming to you. You developed a model called Collaborative Alignment Framework. Can you please tell us what is this framework and how is it used by local communities?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this session and to work with so many great colleagues. I would like to start my comments briefly. Think if you own a truck or a car. And if you don't, a friend perhaps owns a truck or a car. It's in the middle of the rainy, muddy, winter, cold season. I know we got some wonderful ski areas in North Macedonia. Some winter weather comes in. It comes here in Scotland. You're in your truck or your car and you hit a big hole. When you hit a big hole, what happens to the car? Does it drive straight afterward, or do you have to twist the wheel this way or this way? Anyone recall that experience other than me with my family car as a young man? And I got in trouble with my father because he thought I wrecked our car, hitting a Minnesota pothole in the US. The car is out of alignment. Now I want to take you to the state of Wyoming in the western United States. For those of you who have ever traveled in the US, near Yellowstone National Park. I want to tell you about a community called Pinedale, Wyoming. A town of about 8,000 people. Not unlike perhaps some of the smaller communities in North Macedonia or in anywhere in the world. And in this community, they were not in alignment. They were fighting internally. The environmentalists were fighting the timber industry. The county commissioners weren't happy. The National Forest was right there. And people were going to court. They were hiring lawyers. They were suing one another. They were really angry with one another, even though they were neighbors and even though they cared about their community. They were not figuring out a way to work together. The governor of the state of Wyoming, who conservative, Republican, was not happy with this and offered the county money to do something different. And I had the privilege to work with a colleague to spend time in this community to help them develop a locally led climate action program without ever using the term climate action. When I'm in small communities in the US, I can't say climate change. But I can say, is there drought? I can say, is the rainfall not what it was? I can talk to a local farmer or rancher, and that person will take me out on the land and tell me, well, the trees, there's bark disease here, there's beetle disease here, or there's less rainfall, or whatever it is, there's fire risk. And we were able to work with this community, bring a diverse group of stakeholders, environmentalists, tourist operators, local government, state government, national government, timber industry, all got together and we used something called the collaborative alignment approach. Simply put, there were 4 parts to it. One, we worked with them for 2 days on this. First, we addressed purpose, and we think about what Lynn said about purposeful. We focused on purpose. What is the purpose of a group coming together, a diverse group of people, to address issues around the environment, around natural resources, around forestry, around agriculture? Secondly, we said, who are the people we want to reach out to be involved in this, recognizing that the more diverse, the better. and do that in a way that respects, again, all of the local voices in the community. The third was process. How do we bring the parties together in a process that's inclusive, that follows the principles I like to call of faith, of fairness, of accountability, of access, of inclusion, of transparency, of honesty? How do we do that? How do we make decisions? How do we provide opportunities for indigenous knowledge along with local knowledge, as well as the expertise that might come from a university, some technically trained student that maybe had to put up with me in one of my classes? And then lastly, what's the product? What does this group hope to produce? We worked with this group for 2 days. They used the collaborative alignment approach. We were very inclusive, very diverse, and we created a foundation for a collaborative group. This was 5 years ago, that is still operating and has received national attention, including an award of over $700,000 US to focus on wildfire risk. But a big part of getting that was the very nature of a locally led collaborative group. And at least in my work with collaborative alignment, I see this as a way to address climate action, to be locally led. And as I listened to my colleagues on this panel, I wrote down many notes that relate directly to the ideas that we've heard from colleagues. So that's the idea of collaborative alignment. You've now all had a little trip to Wyoming, and hopefully the trucks and cars you ride in don't get out of whack. So,
thank you, Greg. Now I would like to go back to Natalia, who is, I think she's online still. Latin America has adopted the ESCO Agreement recently. So can you please tell us a bit more about it, and how does this agreement support actually citizens' participation?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for that question. And I have two ideas that I want to share around ESCO and citizen participation with you today. My first idea is how ESCO is a product of citizen participation. And second, how ESCO is a regional standard for citizen participation in Latin America and the Caribbean. So for those of you who do not know ESCO Agreement, ESCO Agreement is a treaty that was adopted in 2018 by 24 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean on access to information, participation, and justice in environmental matters. It follows the precedent of the Aarhus Convention adopted in Europe years ago. And my first idea of how ESCO is a product of citizen participation, well, the adoption of ESCO happened because citizens and civil society organizations and indigenous peoples and women worked tirelessly for many years to work with champion governments. Back then, it was Jamaica and Chile, I remember, to adopt a declaration that was basically saying there is a gap in Latin America in terms of implementing access rights. We are seeing many difficulties for people to access information, participation, and of course, access to justice in environmental matters. So we should start a process to work on this and see how we can better implement those rights in Latin America. So that work of citizens to convince governments to start that process was how ESCO started to be negotiated. But then when ESCO was being negotiated, ESCO marked a precedent because it adopted a very strong set of modalities for participation of the public, where citizens from all Latin America could participate in the negotiations. All negotiations were being streamed online. People can register themselves and go to the negotiations by themselves. Countries also agreed to have representatives of the public. So we have an election among the people that were participating in ESCO to elect some representatives that could have a more open dialogue with the negotiation parties. I'm one of those representatives of the public. And one other thing that I think it was really important for ESCO is that us, as the public, as citizens of Latin America and the Caribbean, we could bring our proposals to the negotiation table. And once those proposals were supported by even one party in the negotiation, those proposals were being reflected in the text in negotiation. the representatives of the public also have a seat at the table, a mic that was open to participate directly in the negotiation. So it was a very good precedent that has been recognized by several UN instances and by several governments. And I think that was key to achieve ESCO Agreement as an agreement that guarantees the rights of citizens in Latin America and the Caribbean. My second idea is that ESCO, as I was explaining before, builds on 3 pillars: access to information, participation, and justice. Because it recognizes that when people are able to participate in decision-making processes, those decisions are better accepted and more easily implemented. It was a concept that we bring from Principle 10 in the Rio Declaration of 1992, and that ESCO now is implementing in Latin America and the Caribbean. So ESCO is a floor for all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the region, we have a huge diversity of legislation among countries. Some countries having more advanced laws than others. But with ESCO, we have a common floor. We know what are the common standards. We know what is the minimum standards that countries should guarantee in terms of citizen participation in environmental decision-making processes. But also ESCO built a new standard on the protection of environmental defenders. Why? Because sadly, Latin America and the Caribbean is the most dangerous region in the world for environmental defenders. So we knew that ESCO needed to respond to that trend. And this was also the product of civil society that pushed for ESCO to recognize this. And so parties that were negotiating ESCO decided to adopt one new pillar on environmental democracy, where countries recognize the role of environmental defenders in the region, but also commit to their protection. And I think this is key because we cannot have environmental participation or environmental access to information if we know that the people that is trying to exercise the rights are suffering threats, are suffering violence, or are being killed, and as is still happening in Latin America. So to end, I just want to end with a call for all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to continue ratifying the agreement. We already have 12 countries that have ratified, and that's why the treaty entered into force last year. But we still need many more countries to ratify the agreement, and for those countries that have not signed the agreement, they can now access the agreement and continue working for the implementation of citizen participation in environmental decision-making in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. I would like to use you just for one last question, because you're joining us online. It's a bit difficult to be joining in and out for the speaking slot. We have been hearing a lot of pledges now, so during these COP negotiations. So according to you, what can COP26 leaders do to promote further participation and implementation related to the pledges that we've been hearing? Like one key recommendation that you would give?
Yeah, we have a set of recommendations specifically addressing for COP in our campaign, and those recommendations actually build a lot on the work that the Special Rapporteur did with his last report. But I think that one key recommendation for COP and for following COP negotiations is that parties that are organizing the conference and the UNFCCC Secretariat really recognize the value of participation of civil society and commit to respect that participation, but also commit to respect the rights of freedom of assembly and freedom of association. We think that is key. Any party that commits to organize a COP negotiation should have made those commitments, and commit also and take proactive approaches and proactive steps to ensure citizen participation. We have seen positive developments in some party negotiations that include citizens and civil society representatives among their delegations. We think that's a good step that should be followed by other parties, but also to provide funding and to provide specific and proactive opportunities for citizens and for civil society participation, and especially for indigenous and local communities that are facing the most threats of climate change and also has more difficulties to access this type of negotiations. So I think those are a few steps that could be taken to improve the issue of participation, especially at international negotiations.
Thank you. I will go back to one point that Lynn raised, and that's to collaborate at an innovative level. You just mentioned. So how do we begin the process? How might this be different than the usual way? How can we do these tailor-made approaches and make informed participation as well possible?
Well, I started talking about it earlier as far as a youth-led process, but there are a couple of other things. First of all, hearkening back to what the minister here had to say about science. I think we have to absolutely acknowledge and engage the role of science with that collaboration from its inception, not just put it on as an afterthought at the end, and that science needs to be part of this. We're looking for a goal of building resilience, and I've had the honor of being an IPCC reviewer twice now, and in looking at the changes in how we're looking at resilience from a scientific as well as a social point of view, I think needs to be embedded in the way the collaboration is actually designed. Secondly, there's a connective tissue piece known as education. And in that connective tissue, it's not just education from those of us who are university professors telling you how it's going to be, but learning a two-way education, learning from the questions that the people who are affected are actually asking and need to know. That has not been, it's been lip service, but it has not been effectively done because we have not created the environment. So when we go in to do a true collaborative in a purposeful way with the goal of creating resilience, which the definition is changing under the IPCC, and we can see that, to thriving under change and uncertainty instead of holding back the past and what's the things that are changing. If we're going to do that, we have to engage the process differently and create an ability for ongoing change, not we have reached a solution. And I think the thinking behind that is significantly different in how we go in to begin to create that collaboration. And that's where the paradigm I was discussing, one of the features of that too, as I said, is to have community leader involvement. One of the examples I'll draw on quickly is one that we're doing in the Midlands of the UK with Rotary International and the Rotary Clubs, taking the lead in being the mentor for those youth asking those questions and doing the community science participation, but linking it with data that already exists and with scientific data and through vetted university and processes like Rivers Trust and whatever on a rivers project called Rivers to the Sea. And the ability to do that and replicate that throughout other river systems makes very good sense in terms of vetting not only the youth participation and the community knowledge, but also the knowledge that is in the community leaders and the elders, whether they be an indigenous community, whether they be, it doesn't make any difference what community, those are who are leading the community. Those are the types of things. And like I said, that's why we take the example here of Rotary, because it has an international scope, and they can take the work that's been done in polio over the last years, applying that to new environmental programs, beginning with those long established trusted relationships, which takes a long time to build. So you need to build on existing trusted relationships. But not only do we need to listen, we need to allow that to craft our collaborative process instead of going in and saying, this is what it looks like because we know better.
Thank you. Now, before I open the floor for the questions again, I would ask each of the panelists to refer to the same recommendation or same comment that Natalia gave. So what can COP26 leaders do to promote further participation and implementation related to the pledges that we have been hearing these days? Mr. Remington, I will give you the floor first.
So in some sense, this comment goes beyond, I guess, the nature of your question, or maybe even the nature of what COP leaders think as being their role. But I think that context is everything, and that just as we have lived through or are living through the COVID pandemic, there is a certain sort of pandemic of shrinking civic space moving around the world. Pretty contagious, pretty virulent, more or less the same patterns of of contagion as it moves from country to country. You know, Civicus, last year, Civicus is a large NGO that monitors civic space, and their estimation was that only 42 countries in the world, which was about 3.5% of global population, had protected civic space in 2020, and elsewhere civic space had been shrinking. Without a vibrant civic space that allows for public debate, that allows for public participation, that allows for dissension that will be listened to, as opposed to criminalizing dissension, it will be very hard to carry through COP commitments in ways that are collaborative, that are agreed upon, and that are in some sense just. And so I guess the one thing, if it was one thing that I would ask of COP leaders, it's also to make really strong statements about the necessity of protecting civic space so that the commitments and pledges that are being made at COP can actually be realized in ways, can be realized in general and be realized in ways that are just and inclusive. Absent that, the sorts of transitions that we might be looking at may be very different from the sorts of transition that I expect those of us here at the table are imagining.
Thank you. Minister Noureddini, the government has its own challenges in making it all able as well. So what is your perspective?
Sorry, the government had what?
The government has its own challenges in enabling this participation and implementation afterwards as well.
Yes, I think if I can reflect back on some of the experiences of actually the events I've taken part over the last few days, and I will elaborate maybe a bit more on the Powering Past Coal Alliance event pledge, which we as a country signed on in June this year. And there were a few more new members who signed up at the COP. This has been headed by the UK presidency, and I think it is a very important alliance. For us, it is of utmost importance, and why do I actually want to stipulate on that? Because for us, it means we're going to shut down and decommission our coal-fired power plants. We have 2 of them. And we're planning on doing that by 2027, 8 latest, by any means, 2030, and they have to be decommissioned. Now, making a pledge like that is nice on paper, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot of applause from people. But that's not the intention behind it, of course, because this is why it's very important of actually the participation of everybody. Because currently 66%, approximately over 60% to 66% of our energy is being produced by these coal-fired power plants. So in order for us to be able to do this and achieve the decommissioning of these power plants, we will have to get the financial institutions on board, we need to get the private sector, and very importantly, of course, the civil society. Because when I spoke earlier about the mannerism and our daily mannerism, consumerism, this is going to have to be done in hand with all the stakeholders in our country, so that we can actually achieve diversification of our energy sources, which is going to definitely have to be renewable, partially alternative. It's going to have to be hydropower plant as well, a large one. We're not looking at small ones, so there's a large one for the region. However, the key thing, though, is when we speak about achieving this is energy efficiency and getting our industry modernized and using more sustainable methods for production. This is going to have to be, for me, it's imperative that we work together with civil societies and they stand side by side with us. And again, when I say they partner us, I mean they are literally partner us, because we rely on them to achieve this. Otherwise, unfortunately, this might be on paper and we won't be able to achieve decommissioning the power plants. We as a country have the possibility to finance it until then. However, though, we need all the actors in our society to participate in order for us to be able to achieve that. So this is a pledge that we're definitely, as I said, I wanted to highlight that because we're going to keep our word for it. But I would also like to maybe just quote the executive director of the International Energy Association, Mr. Fatih Birol. Because I said we're a country in transition, and there's a lot of developing countries which will need more support than that. It's easy for developed countries to change their production and the way they act. They have the financial means. But if we want the developing countries to be part, and as the name of this event is Solving the Climate Crisis Together, it's North Macedonia, as I said, we're a small country, but we're definitely willing to do our part. But there's other countries which need more support. So we need the developing countries to support the developing countries, otherwise we're not going to make it. It's quite simple, really. I'm going to make a little comparison between the pandemic we're currently going through, COVID-19. If we do not support the developing countries to get the vaccinations, this is going to be around for a lot longer. COVID-19 was a surprise. Climate change is not. We've been speaking about it for a couple of decades. So we need to actually, developing countries need to support the developed countries need to support the developing. At the same time, I think the developed countries and the developed CSOs need to support the CSOs in the developing countries and get their voices be heard globally as well, for the regions where it's a bit more difficult, as we heard from some panelists here. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg, what is your key recommendation for the COP26 leaders to promote further participation?
I've been to 12 of these, and some of you have been to more, some perhaps less, and there's this disconnect between the observers, the civil society organizations, the non-state actors, and the state actors. And this is a oversimple answer. I wish there was more interaction. At the same time, I teach international negotiation, and I understand well that sometimes the best decisions come about because they're behind closed doors. And so, on the one hand, we have to respect the parties and the difficulties that they have in working through issues. On the other hand, I think we need to explore ways that civil society organizations can contribute their wisdom, their knowledge to the work of the parties, and particularly the parties that may be at a disadvantage because they don't have the big staff that some of the developed or more economically wealthy countries have. So it's an excellent question, but not a simple answer. How do you, in fact, redesign the process? I'll add one thing. When my students ask me about what's the COP like, I say, imagine a family reunion of 200 people. Aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents, they all show up, and they're going to get together in the summer or for a holiday, but they have to agree on the menu. How easy would it be for 200 members of your extended family to agree to the menu? And in a way, that's what we're struggling with. We respect the voices, hopefully, of all the countries of the world, but at the same time, we have to recognize that we're in a situation that's increasingly urgent. So I think we have to really provide creative ideas. I know that Mediators Beyond Borders, an organization I'm part of, and my colleague Christine, who's sitting in the audience, has worked with a colleague here in the UK to try to imagine ways to make the negotiations progress perhaps faster than they have. But it's an important question. I'm still hopeful, and I think the expectations are very high for Glasgow, and I think the higher the expectations, as we saw in Paris, I think that's a big part of it as well. So.
Bless you. Are you all right?
It's the wrong tube problem. Okay.
It's all right.
Nadine, it's the same question for you. Yeah.
Well, I've only been to 10, I think, COPs, so I'm not quite as seasoned as Greg, but I have watched this process for a while. And I think that, first of all, we have to understand that the negotiators are under unusual pressure, not only from COVID and the situation, but from the fact that basically nothing has happened in 3 years because of not having a COP, because of what happened in Madrid, and many people couldn't get there. And I would hope that we've learned a lesson that, and for those of us that participated this summer in the intersessionals, the 3-week online issues, that this isn't the last time this is going to happen. And if there's a message or something that could be taken here back to those that can make these decisions is that we must find a meaningful way to be able to take votes and to work remotely that is fair, equitable in terms of access to developing countries and places with limited bandwidth and the things that we have encountered this summer. But that if we don't do that and we don't bring that particular elephant out in the room and face it, that we really have undercut our own process that we've all been working on for so very long. And to me, that's an important conversation that I have heard very few people willing to take up because it isn't very popular, but it needs to be addressed if we want to have a vibrant and durable multilateral process.
Thank you. Now, we've managed to have some time for comments and questions from the audience, so I will invite everyone who wants to take part to take their hand. My colleagues are supposed to be giving, letting you know. You need to stand up and use one of the mics. I'm sorry, but my colleagues should tell you which one after another to go. Yeah, the order.
There is a mic behind
Thank you very much, and I want to sincerely appreciate us all. Abidin Olasukbo is my name. I'm from Nigeria, and of course, fortunately for us, today is the Youth Day. So I'd like to get a perspective of the panelists on, beyond inviting young people to COP, beyond using them as advocates around issues on environment, net emission. What are the plans, especially in funding their initiative, especially those who work at the grassroots community? And secondly, I would like to get our perspective on climate data. Because how do we track some of these promises? In the next 5 years, what will you have achieved? What are the monitoring and evaluation framework available? And in terms of recommendations as well, I think subsequently we should also try our best to ensure more indigenous people, more civil society from grassroots community who know or nothing about issues around climate are involved in conversations like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone from the panelists would like to answer this question? Was it directed to someone specifically? No, I don't think. Maybe Minister Noureddini on the youth angle, because we have some experience with that in our country.
I'm a bit torn about that. I hope you don't mind. I'm a father as well, and I have a child. And yes, of course, I think the youth should be involved, but in no way possible should we misuse the youth in that sense. So please don't. It's a personal answer for me here. I think it is absolutely that we have to listen to the youth and their engagement. In no way should they be misused, though, for us to make not us, me as a person, not as a politician, to misuse the youth for anything. So I'm going to have to be careful in that answer. Please do. If you don't mind me refraining to answer that properly, because it's more of a personal answer. But I can tell you one thing that I agree with you, that COP should not be just here to make new pledges. I think we should have COP and then speak about what we've been doing the last year. That's a proposal maybe for the presidency, next presidency, to actually make a comment on that, because this is my second time, not my 12th time. My second, I was in Madrid 2 years ago, and this is something that I personally as well agree with you. I don't see us being held accountable as politicians or as government members in the sense of what have we achieved since the last COP. I agree with you on that. Unfortunately, that is missing, and that's something I think we should all look into, maybe addressing for the future.
Okay, maybe Lynn, you would like to make a comment.
Yeah, you mentioned the use of data and so forth too, and I think that's an important thing. We were talking about where data comes from, and if it comes from the people and comes from the field, and this goes back to our pilot in the UK, where we're using GIS to encapsulate what we're learning, but also link it to other data sources to check. And if we were to measure progress, not just by what is done here, but what is the impact on the ground for the people that we are doing it for, and have that progress be measured by those folks and fed back into the system, perhaps that would in part address your question, and the ability to have that presented through the knowledge bases of the countries that are most affected.
Thank you. Next question. Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking you for arranging a session on this topic, which I think is very important. I am an academic and also a member of Mediators Beyond Borders International, very committed to thinking about these issues. I have two kinds of basic questions. One is I came just before this from a energy transition session featuring youth, and one of the panelists, a young woman from South America, brought up the point that often participatory process, in fact, well, she said typically participatory process takes more time, at least in the short run, than other kinds of processes, and yet the youth in particular that she was speaking for feel a sense of great urgency about making progress on this issue. So I wonder how you all think about sort of balancing the need for participation with the need for moving so quickly. And then the second question is about, many of us assume that participatory processes will lead to progress on climate change, but in the face of rising populism, at least in some places, I realize this is very contextual, it's not a guarantee necessarily that having more participation will lead towards desired outcomes. So I wonder if you, from our perspective as climate advocates, so I wonder if you could comment on that question as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Whoever would like to.
Would you like to, Mr. Bevington, would you like to answer part of the questions?
So I just wanted to take it's really a comment at the first question, because I think the urgency issue is a real one. So in that not only in the kind of dilemma that you pose, but clearly issues are urgent, clearly the transition has to happen quickly, and yet we also know that narratives of urgency are often used as rationales and justifications for closing down civic space again. And in fact, for centralizing power and authority as well. You know, the narrative is, it's urgent, we have to do it, we are the we will do it, and you have to trust us. That's not an answer to your question about how to resolve the dilemma, but I think a contextual necessity for resolving that dilemma is the importance of making sure, with other sorts of narratives about urgency, that urgency is not co-opted as a vehicle for indulging the sorts of populist and authoritarian tendencies that you referred to in your second question, because I think it's a genuine risk.
And I've been told we've been out of time, so I can take only one more question, or maybe we can just answer quickly, Greg, the second question that was raised, and then we can all continue afterwards outside with the discussion.
Well, I'll tell you what I tell my students. We talk a lot about how to involve youth meaningfully, and we've already heard this from colleagues on the panel. I tell them to don't be a spectator. Get involved in political races. Obviously participate in whatever outlets you have within your country, and simply find outlets for that. Organizations, whether it's 350.org or whether it's some other organization in one's local community. Don't sit on the sidelines, make your voice heard. And then I tell them to have conversations with their families. We don't have enough conversations with our families, and we should listen to the younger generation and their concerns. And so a lot of different avenues to do that, but I like to listen to my students and turn the question around and say, how do you want to be involved to make meaningful change that you're going to be experiencing for the next 70 years of your life? And I learn a lot from them, and I think that it is important that we involve youth as much as we can. But I can tell you as a grandparent, it doesn't mean I understand my grandkids as well as I'd like, but I'm trying.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining here today, and please feel free to...
Do we have one more quick question?
No, we have to...
Then we can answer him outside, though. If we have another question, we know who can speak to the gentleman.
Okay.
Actually, the last speaker substantially asked the question, but I'll put the question to the minister. You're very engaged in interacting with civil society. What measures are you able to take, or civil society, to do the kind of community-based participatory deliberation that Lynn and Greg spoke of? Does any of that go on in your country?
Yes, I think because I see Usain Bolt's world record being ticked down here, I'm supposed to be running out. Do you mind if we actually continue outside? I'm going to speak to you because the timer is going down here.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.